Okay, class, this is part 2 of video 2, and before I talk to you about the details and sort of main principles of the new Constitution that the Constitutional Convention drafted, I want to first talk about the battle over ratifying or approving the Constitution. So what I want you to do, and to follow along as you listen to this video, is go back to your PowerPoint copy that's entitled The Constitutional Convention, and then turn to the second to last, or actually, the last page, and there's a slide there that looks like this. It says the battle over ratification of the Constitution. So as we talked about in the last video and in your reading, the meeting that was held in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania in 1787, was originally the purpose of the meeting was to try to fix the Articles of Confederation, and the members at that meeting, 12 of the 13 states represented, quickly determined that the Articles were simply unfixable. So they scrapped them and began writing a new constitution. And it took them the whole summer, 3 months, to do so. And we talked about the major disagreements, areas of disagreement, and then the major compromises that were necessitated to enable the document to be written. So now the document's been written. But before it can go into effect, it has to be approved or, quote, ratified by the states. And as you recall, the Articles of Confederation required that before it went into effect, all 13 states had to ratify or approve it. So the Founding Fathers who drafted the U.S. Constitution, after having gone through that very arduous experience and taking almost 5 years to get the Articles of Confederation ratified by all the states, they said, you know what, we're not going to make such a high hurdle for this second Constitution. They decided that it would go into effect after 9 of the 13 states ratified it. So the Constitution went out to the 13 states, and in each state they held a convention or a large meeting of representatives of their state in order to review the Constitution. And even the people who drafted the Constitution, many of them went home to their respective states very unhappy with the document. And some of them were so unhappy with the various compromises that had been made and included in the document that they were advising people in their home states not to ratify it, to vote against it. And so what happened is there were sort of two camps that formed. One group that called the Federalists, and they supported the new Constitution and worked for its ratification. They believed that this new country, in order to grow and become a powerful and strong country, needed the new, much stronger national government that was written into this Constitution. And those, the Federalist group that favored ratification, were led really by 3 men, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And those 3 men wrote a series of essays, both explaining the various provisions of the Constitution and then arguing why those provisions, and as well as the entire Constitution, should be ratified. And those essays were collected and published as a book and are known today as the Federalist Papers. And in fact, when there are legal disputes that go to court today and lawyers are arguing about various provisions of the Constitution and what they mean and how they should be applied in various factual situations, oftentimes they go back and cite parts of the Federalist Papers as the best evidence of what the Founding Fathers meant by the words that they wrote in the Constitution. So those are still very much looked at and very important essays in the Federalist Papers. Now, those on the other side that opposed ratification of the Constitution, they were called anti-Federalists. So you had the Federalists on the one side favoring ratification and the anti-Federalists on the other side. And the anti-Federalists were led by men like Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, who was the cousin of John Adams, and also Patrick Henry, real instrumental in a leader in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. But they were very concerned about maintaining states' rights. And they just felt this new, much more powerful national government that was contemplated by the Constitution would just strip the states of all of their autonomy and rights, and would become a very oppressive national government, similar to what they had just gotten rid of by winning the Revolutionary War and ridding themselves of the British. So they were very much advocating in opposition to the Constitution. So this slide talks about the leaders of the Federalist movement in the Federalist Papers. Here are the anti-Federalist leaders and their arguments. And really, the best argument the anti-Federalists really had, in addition to stripping the states of too much power, is that this new Constitution did not contain protections for individual rights. In each of the 13 states, after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, had quickly drafted and adopted their own state constitutions. And each of those state constitutions had protections for individual rights written into them. But this new U.S. Constitution did not. And the Federalists argued that that wasn't necessary, that the way the government was designed, divided power at the national government was divided amongst 3 different branches, and all of which had checks and balances, and we'll talk more about that in the next video, to ensure that no one branch could dominate the other 2, and that would be sufficient to protect individual rights. The Anti-Federalists said, no, that's not sufficient. We need an explicit Bill of Rights to make sure this national, stronger government did not become oppressive and take away people's rights. And actually, the Federalists, those are the Anti-Federalist Papers that were also written primarily by Patrick Henry, and that's the video. So the Federalists had to admit that this argument about a lack of protections for individual rights that the Anti-Federalists making was pretty persuasive, and it looked like there were a lot of states that were going to refuse to approve the Constitution. So what the Federalists did is said, okay, you Anti-Federalists, will make you a deal. If you will agree to vote in favor of the Constitution in your states, or at least stop opposing ratification of it, we will, as soon as the Constitution is ratified, we will amend it by adding a Bill of Rights, explicit protection for individual rights. And with that deal made, the Anti-Federalists were persuaded to withdraw their opposition to the Constitution, and the votes on ratification went forward in each of the states. And this slide shows when the votes took place in each state and what the vote was. You'll see that Delaware was the very first, by unanimously approved the Declaration, or the Constitution, in December 1787. But there were a lot of pretty close votes. Pennsylvania was second, but that was a fairly close vote. New Jersey was all in. Georgia was all in. A little bit closer in Connecticut. very close in Massachusetts. Massachusetts being the home of Sam Adams, a strong anti-federalist. And then we go down, and New Hampshire voted in June of 1788. And New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. So upon New Hampshire's vote for ratification, the Constitution, by its own terms, went into effect. Right? But there was still a problem, because the two biggest, most popular states in the Union were Virginia and New York. And they still had not held their vote on ratification. So until, unless you got those two big states to go along, even though you had 9 states and it technically by its terms went into effect, you really was not going to be effective until you really got those two big states to go along. So Virginia held its vote in June of 1788, and you can see how close it was, 89 to 79. And then New York followed, and New York was, Alexander Hamilton is from New York, and he really led the push for the Federalists in that state. But it was a very, very close vote, 30 to 27, okay? So then, by that time, you had those two big states that were on board. And then North Carolina followed in the fall of 1789. And then not till the following spring, remember Rhode Island? They were the ones that didn't even bother to send any representatives to the Constitutional Convention. They finally decided in the spring of 1790 that, well, we might as well go along and ratify it too. But look how close the vote was, 34 to 32. They barely decided to join up. But once they did, we had all 13 states on board. Okay? And I think, okay. So the U.S. Constitution is effective, and in the next video I will talk about the main principles of the Constitution. But let me just finish here by saying that we had our first federal election, and to vote for our first president, and as you know, it was George Washington, and he's our only president to be unanimously elected. Everyone wanted him. Remember, he had presided over the Constitution, and he was the Revolutionary War hero as well, so he was probably the most important person in the 13 states at the time. So he was inaugurated or sworn in Federal Hall on Wall Street in New York City being designated as the nation's first temporary capital under the Constitution. So there's a painting of him. And, here's a photograph of Federal Hall today with a statue of George Washington outside. And just kitty corner from this building is Wall Street, where the New York Stock Exchange is. So if you get to New York City, make sure you go down to Wall Street and see Federal Hall, where George Washington is still standing. Okay, I think that's it for now. Have a good night, and I will be talking to you about the rest, sort of the real construction of the Constitution in the next video. Thanks.